So, just continue from what you said. So, monitoring and measuring. I've got a new person as well. So, hi. I missed the first half. So
I'll try and make it.
the second half is the best half. So, yeah, with monitoring and measuring, you need to have systems in place to monitor and measure what you're doing. We're going to go through some examples. So, I can't tell you right now what you should be measuring, but as you go through, you might get some ideas of what you can measure, and it all stems from what you can experiment on. But you should never do an experiment without measurement. So it's not just try and see or trial and error. There really is some sort of like method, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So there's a cycle that we go through when we do security chaos engineering. The first is plan. We need to plan what we're going to do. And this comes from Deming, by the way, plan do. He originally called it Plan Do Check Act, but then he thought the word check meant too much of a just tick. When he really thought you really need to study the result. So he called it Plan Do Study Act. People have taken it on board ever since. But people still use Plan Do Check Act. Use study, it's better. So with planning, you create a hypothesis. And you set your experiment up with your plan. Then you do the experiment by injecting variables in. It doesn't have to be a single variable; it can be multiple variables into your system to get a reaction. And hopefully that reaction will be an expected reaction. But as I said earlier, you might also have unexpected reactions. So you then have to study the results and understand what it is that you're being told by the results of the experiment. And once you've done that, you can act and do something about it. So action, obviously, there are different ways of looking at action, because you can either prevent the so the action could be prevented. So once you've done this experiment, you're going to be left in a different state. So you can either prevent the next step from happening. You could remediate the problem straight away, so that if you've done an experiment and it's highlighted the problem, then you can fix it. And then, of course, the third one is just acknowledge it's been detected, to do nothing, but acknowledge it's been detected. So, as I said, I'm going to have some examples of some security chaos engineering. I've got a slide for notes anyway. Okay. Right, so here's the first one. The hypothesis or plan. Vulnerabilities are detected within your build pipeline. Right? So you've got to build a pipeline, and your developers are writing code, and they click commit or whatever you're using, and it sends the code through the pipeline. That hopefully will mean that code ends up in production. Now, I don't know how mature your systems are, but this is a suggestion that you've got almost like a one-click deployment process. So bear with me because it is relevant still. So here's the experiment. Insert known vulnerabilities into your software. Right? So that's what you're going to do. You're going to insert a vulnerability. And that could be anything. Like you could write, I don't know, you could, what can you do? You could introduce a known vulnerable open source piece of software into your code. So perhaps reverting back to a previous version that was less secure or had a vulnerability. Or you could be looking at, I don't know, writing something to the logs that you should be writing to the logs, like a password or something. Does that get picked up in your pipeline? So then we analyze results. Did you manage to detect that piece of software that had a vulnerability? And if so, were you able to patch it or replicate it while doing or remove the known vulnerability from the component? That is what you're looking to see the result of, yeah? Based on that, you act. So you need to make sure that you revert back to a steady state. And as I said, you can either remediate the problem, you can roll back the problem, or you could just acknowledge that it's been detected and move on. But that is an example of a security chaos engineering experiment. another one we can try, and there's thousands of these. If you get that book, that report, there are a whole bunch of examples that you can have a play with. So how about this one? You inject credentials or keys into your logs. And they shouldn't be there because if a hacker can get hold of your logs, they can obviously see those credentials and use them. So you don't want any credentials in your logs. So let's put some in there, see what happens. So we inject credentials or keys into your build logs. How quickly were those credentials identified? Were they removed? That is what you're trying to find out. And then again, you want to go back to a steady state. So you want to make sure the credentials and keys are removed from the logs. It could be that they're old credentials, in which case you might say, okay, we've detected that this is a problem, but they're old credentials, you're fine. But we might want to revert back. The other thing, so these have been on the pipeline. We can also do things in production. And people say, oh no, you should do security engineering in production. It's the wrong place to do it. In fact, I say, argue it's the best place to do it because our systems are so complex that we've probably all got stage and development and testing environments. Is it an exact replica of your production environment? It probably isn't. It definitely isn't. I would say if it is an exact replica, then it hasn't got the same customer data, it hasn't got the same. It's probably got missing components or even components that you've been too afraid to take out and it's still in there. But you've taken it out in other environments. There's all sorts of things I've seen. So production is the place to do your testing because that is your big unknown. So in this one, we're going to execute pseudo commands because the idea is that pseudo commands should not be possible in a production environment. So we are going to try and do that. So we execute pseudo commands in production, and then we study the results. Are we able to detect when a pseudo command has been executed and is it audited? And is in production. And that's what we're trying to find out. Yes.
Sorry, what's a pseudo command?
A pseudo command is the ability to actually run something that runs an admin in a Linux box. Is that right? Yeah.
Okay.
Super user do.
Yeah.
It gives you root access.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And Macs as well, isn't it? Because it's Linux based. And then obviously, once you've done that experiment, you've got to go back to as a good state again. So you want to make sure that whatever that command ran as sudo, you deal with it. You either remediate it, you ignore it, or you fix it. So there are three ideas of doing security chaos engineering. There are loads more in the report if you want to check it out. But you can go with your own ideas. These are. And one thing that this is not red teaming. It's not penetration testing. This is dealing how you deal with a problem that could lead to a hack or someone breaching you. So it's not actually a penetration test as such, or a red teaming exercise, or even blue teaming exercise. It is unique in that sense. So I'm just going to finish on a few. Is it finish? We've got a few more. So security chaos. That's what I was just giving you some examples of what I think security chaos engineering is, and these are security chaos experiments. This is what security chaos experiments do not do. They do not validate a config. They exercise it. This is going back to what I said earlier. That it's not a red teaming or a penetration test. It is an experiment. So they're actually exercising what you've got there. It's not there to check authentication privileges. It uses them. Yeah? So it's using authentication privileges. And therefore they're trying to thwart them as well. They're trying to get around your authentication. They do not trust network settings. They actually send real traffic. So again, it's not like a test in that sense. they don't check application policy. They actually do stuff with the application itself. They actually interact and may affect the policies. So they're not checking the application policy, they're actually working with those policies and doing stuff with those policies. And again, they don't build a model from infrastructure templates. They help you build an understanding of your system through the process of experimentation. They help you fill those gaps of what you don't understand. So they're not there to try and help you build templates. They're there to try and help you understand what you have. So this is where I usually say, right, here are some key takeaways from today, but I don't actually have any key takeaways because I want to know, as I said, this is the first time I've done this. I want my key takeaways from you guys. So and this is why I said I have my question in the other round. So what are your key takeaways from today? What have you learned today that you didn't know before you came here? And what do you think you should know, or would like to have learned that you didn't think you learned today? Does anyone like a start on that one?
I'd like to know the beginning half.
That's a good one. Anyone want to help?
Chaos. There's a video.
Yeah, it'll be on YouTube next week.
Yeah. A butterfly flaps its wings.
The butterfly that doesn't live in Brazil flaps its wings in Brazil and causes a tornado in Texas. It's a holiday from Mexico. Yeah.
And having seen the earlier part, this question may be the wrong question to
Is there
ask.
something wrong question?
But I wonder how this integrates.
Maybe you should walk into the camera view. Get a microphone there.
Is there a
Oh
camera?
my god, you're actually going to do it.
I'm in the
okay.
camera. Hi everyone. I'm Mark. Right, so
The guy that turned up late.
my question, which may have been answered, is how does this integrate with how you observe and monitor chaos engineering from a business perspective? Like, how do you kind of get an understanding of? Do you have coverage? Do you have? And how do you judge whether coverage is a usable metric, or what is your metric for sustaining and maintaining this?
Yeah, so you cannot measure the process of security chaos engineering, but what you can do is you can monitor and measure your experiments. You can't understand whether it's not like doing a code scan where you're going to have some sort of coverage metric. That's not going to exist. They're vanity metrics anyway. They don't really help you understand whether you're secure or not. What they tell you is that the trouble is when you create metrics like that, you tend to gamify. You tend to turn it into I can't remember how the phrase goes, but if you create a metric and you measure that metric and you set objectives around that metric, then people will find a way to gain that metric. So and we're all doing that now, right? So if you're told you've got to write a certain number of lines of code by the end of next week, then you'll write a whole lot of fluff in there to make sure you hit that target, right? When actually 2 lines of code would have done the same job. So you teach people how to gamify. So you can't really measure, say, security chaos engineering, but what you can do is you can take measurements from each of the experiments. Those 3 experiments are provided there. You've got ways of measuring the output. So you've got ways of measuring, how much of your pipeline was able to identify that you have a vulnerability. We're able to identify you have stuff in credentials and keys in your logs. These are things you can measure, and you can monitor as well, continuously monitor it as well. So the idea is that if someone does start to inject credentials and keys into your old files, then you'll know about it. But the chaos engineering tells you whether you can find out about it or not. It tells you whether you know about it or not. That's sort of how it works. So you're building measurement capabilities into your system as you go along. So rather than trying to measure the chaos engineering helps you build the measurements that you need in your system. So going back to which you missed, go back to earlier about drifting into failure. It helps us understand where we potentially have the risks of drifting too far into security failure. I might need to show you the slide from earlier for you to understand that.
Yeah, I'll let everyone else ask better questions.
So any other takeaways from today that you feel that you learned or didn't learn? Or?
I think what I'm interested in knowing a bit more is, imagine you have an environment, a company or something that has a certain system, it's running, they just never thought about doing any of security before. what would be the kind of like minimal introduction of chaos security to that organization, and what would be, as a follow-up, what would be like the way to maintain this over time? Like how do you maintain that behavior?
Yeah, so how do you get started? So the question is, how do you get started in doing like security chaos engineering? And then once you've got started, how do you maintain that? So, yeah. So getting started is really start from basics. I mean, I've given you 3 examples there. They're not really difficult to do. They're all pretty easy to do. Some easier than others. There are going to be other things you can do. It's got to be context in what you're doing as well. So you can't, there are 3 examples, but you will have other examples you can do. So start small and start building the process that way. So introduce an experiment and then get results from that. Do another experiment, just piece by piece. So although it's a systemic problem in terms of like trying to understand, like if you affect this here, does it affect something over here? What you're trying to do is you need to build it up systematically. You need to create more and more experiments to try and understand the capability of the system. But the other thing I didn't mention as well is go back to the whole idea of the butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, Mexico. It happens. Or a tornado happens in Texas. The whole idea behind that really is that a small change here can have a big impact over here, and we just don't know the chain of events that leads to that. We don't understand that chain of events. It's too complex for us to understand that. And the same thing that happens in security. You can make a small change here. You can have make a change in terms of I don't know, any sort of like security context change you want to make. Let's say you thinking about the CIA triad, like the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. What about if you took one of your microservices or an API out of service? So you're challenging the availability side of your security triad. Take something out. You might think, well, actually, that will affect those items that are calling and just those only. They should all be able to handle that error. But then one of them doesn't, and it leads to another problem further down the line that happens in about a week's time. Because there's a whole chain of events that leads to that. And you get a disgruntled customer because they didn't get the order they wanted. Just because you took that one API out that was doing something you had no context at all within, it would never affect that customer. So that's, start small, but you can find big problems. That's the thing. Right? So that's the reason why it's important to monitor. You need to document what you've done. If you don't document what you've done, someone says, oh, our customer's lost this data, unable to do this. It's like, well, actually, that ties back to this experiment we did on that day. Then you can.
How do you do that tying back?
Well, that's how you need to have that monitored system. So you need to be able to do it's almost like a root cause analysis. So go backwards from that to see why would that happen, or even hypothesize and run more experiments further down the chain to try and understand what's going on.
Because obviously you can have the old I can't remember half, but causation. There's a difference between causation and
Correlation.
correlation. That's the word I was looking for. Yes, correlation.
So running more, creating more hypotheses. So you could say, okay, we think the chain does this, or we'll run another experiment further down the line that affects another system, and say, okay, it looks like we think that means that this particular data here didn't get transmitted to that API. Let's stop the API from collecting that data and see what happens. Then you might say, oh, okay, yeah, that's actually proved the hypothesis right. And then you start getting more closer to where the problem might lie. But the thing is, it's so complex that quite often, I know that in Lean and Six Sigma, they talk about the 5 whys. The trouble with 5 whys is that I sort of agree with it in some respects to get to some sort of root cause analysis, but that assumes that there's a more simple linear correlation or causation in that sense. But what you need to be aware of is that some of the systems we're building don't have that linear causality. There's feedback loops, there's other things that go on. It could even be a piece where it goes out the system back in again, and there's a human intervention. So there's lots of things that could change. As a result of making one small change, lots of big changes happen further down the line.
Stories about the server crash every night. The servers crash every night at a certain time, and we couldn't work out why. until they realised it was the cleaner coming in. I'm plugging in a vacuum cleaner. It's probably apocryphal.
Yeah, I think so.
I have worked for a company where the sales traffic every day at 11 a.m.
Was that something like that, or was it?
It wasn't exactly 11 a.m. It varied between about 10:45 and about 11:15, but they were all crashed.
And was that a strange reason, or was that just...
It was a memory, the amount of memory.
Okay.
Oh.
So it was a memory.
Memory. It was always the same time frame. It was very.
Did they ever fix it?
The fix
All
was
memory.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So how many of you feel confident that tomorrow you can go to work and introduce one experiment? One other thing I should make you aware of, right? When you do an experiment, you do not do it in isolation. You let people know that you're doing an experiment. Not necessarily people, if people are part of the experiment, you might not want to tell them. Right?
Like how you're not supposed to tell people that they're having phishing attacks. Like,
Yeah.
in your own company, you're doing more phishing
But
attacks.
it's not
Well, they tell everyone first.
Yeah, it's not trying to. Well, you're not trying to find someone to blame. It's not like a witch hunt or anything. Trying to find some issue. What you're trying to do here is you're trying. So you go back to that one about injecting credentials into a log, right? You wanted to be able to do that and see if someone picks it up and do they remediate it, whether it's automated or manual. Does that get fixed? That's what you're trying to try. That's what you're trying to prove. That's what you're trying to hypothesize that gets done. And if it doesn't get done, you need to understand why it doesn't get done and fix that problem. You fix it at a systemic level. You don't turn around and say, well, that person there didn't do his job properly, or she didn't do her job properly. That's not what it's all about. It's about understanding the problem systemically and fixing the system.
Is
Yeah,
that,
also,
no, just is that kind of where you were joking about? Oh, when an error pops up and you go, oh, that's been there for years. We just don't worry about it. Is it that kind of talking about that idea?
Yeah. So the systemic problem there.
Yeah.
So you've got normalisation of deviance. That's what I was trying to think of earlier. So normalisation of deviance is where you do that. You normalise what goes wrong, and you make that thing that goes wrong all the time make it right. And because of that, you put yourself into a more risky state.
What do you do when you work in organisations though that have an attitude where you create someone creates a ticket saying that we're sending you username and passwords for X percentage of accounts to Facebook and a bunch of other advertising companies, right? And everyone knows this is because it's there on the Jira board, and it sits there for 9 months and nobody gives it that. At that point, because as much as you want to introduce better engineering practices, there are so many organisations which just really don't give a damn.
When you say organisations don't give a damn, who doesn't give? Because organisations are people, so who doesn't?
They're not. Ultimately, it's the executive level.
The executive level. So it's a risk they're willing to take, obviously. And if
At that point, but then
if they're willing to take that risk, then it's there's things that you can communicate to them and say, look, this is a risk that you're taking, and they can make a call and say, so what? I don't care.
many companies I've worked in have said the executive fundamentally don't actually understand what the problem is in front of them.
Well, that's a different question.
And they systemically lack risk management. And because they
Yeah.
systemically lack risk management and quality assurance, and they fundamentally don't understand the problem in front of them, it's really hard to argue for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. It is hard to argue for it, but this is why I said if you started to introduce, there's something called like change by attraction. So the idea is that you start to make these small changes in your organisation, and if you bring in the right stakeholders, you start getting more and more people wanting to do that change. So in the end, it becomes natural, becomes part of the organisation. So rather than trying to influence someone at the senior executive level to say you've got to do something, you actually do it from the low level and build up trust that way and develop it that way. That's harder if you've got lots of work to do, because it's going to be the business. Or the alternative is to come call me in and I can go speak to the executives and give them some strategic decisions, help with some strategic decisions.
Or start looking for another company to work for.
Oh, contractors. So I come across these companies too often.
I was going to say,
Someone there's been nice companies along the way, but too often it's not as nice as I hope.
You say either it's an ICO report that tends to light a fire under their arse, or or if the executive team really don't know what's going on, how are they going to know what you're doing? Go and fix it anyway.
Yeah,
Oh, no,
exactly.
they know what's going on. It's just their priority is feature, not fix.
Tell them to fix.
So,
feature delivery.
so that's what I was saying. So again, let me go back to that slide actually, because
Going back in time.
So this is the one I'm referring to earlier. Let's go to that. So this is what I'm saying. So what you're saying here, the executives that you usually have two things on their mind. One, key concern is economic failure. So this is where they want more and more features. And the other one is boundary to acceptable workloads. So you've got workloads that they need to take on, and but they need to keep that to a minimum because of the resources they have. If you overcook it, then you're going to get burnout basically. So the executives are always pushing in that direction, and this is where it leads into the problem, this problem boundary, which is the boundary to security failure. So I was mentioning this earlier in the first part of the talk, so apologies for those that have already heard this, but it might be nice to have a refresher. So the idea is that if you start doing these experiments, what you're going to try and do is you're going to try and find where your spots are, whereabouts are you in terms of your security, because if you can actually show to your executives, look, we could end up here because you're forcing us this way, and the whole company could fail through a security problem, a security incident that could take the company out. And that does happen. It happens a lot, you know, with ransomwares and data breaches. But, you know, they might not be catastrophic to a company in terms of killing it off, but certainly catastrophic to their bottom line. You know, I mean, Equifax still haven't recovered their share prices. They had that attack about 7 years ago.
I was going to say reputational damage is also a factor.
Yeah.
I think Funky Pigeon had a security issue a few years ago, and Moonpig really saw.
Yeah. So
they revelled in it.
But the problem is false incentives, because as an employee or as a contractor in an organisation, your financial benefit, you basically get promoted. You renew your contract because you delivered features. Nobody ever sacked you because you didn't fix the security bug. The only time they sack you because you didn't fix the security bug is when they're sacking the whole company because they've lost a hell of a lot of money. At which point it wasn't your fault, and you just go to the next contract and the next job. So the false incentive scheme at the moment in most companies, when I spoke to a company that had a huge security problem, and the CTO said, how the hell do we fix this? I said, you have to stop giving bonuses to people saying deliver features. You have to start saying, you have to deliver features, but you also have to fix them. And how are you proving both? And he's just like...
I totally agree with that. I'm a big fan of someone called W. Idris Denny, and he thinks that the whole idea of giving bonuses based on performance is absolutely the worst idea ever. And it starts off education in schools. You know, when you get graded an A or B or C or D based on whether your teacher likes what you do or not, right? And you learn from a very early age that if you fit into the model, you get a good grade. If you don't, you get a poor grade. And you then take it into work. And you get a good grade, you get bonuses. If you don't get a good grade, you get a lower bonus or no bonus. But these are always based on the wrong metrics. They're always based on fast delivery or fast delivery of cash to your stakeholder shareholders. It's a problem across Western culture. So you're not going to fix
capitalism.
Yeah. Well, you can have a profit organisation, but share profit against everybody. You know, give, like at school, give everybody an A, right? And make sure that everybody can achieve that A by tapping into what it is that those kids can do better. Yeah? Not every kid's going to get an A in maths, but give them an A in life. You know, because
That's not good.
I mean, like is it Rishi Sunak? I don't want to get political. Rishi Sunak this week said something about he wants all 18-year-olds to be proficient in maths. Now, there's also another one I saw where a young school leaver went into the House of Commons just before Christmas and read out a letter from as a representation of the school children in the country, in which she said, I think she started it, she said, minus b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2, right? Which is a calculus maths at school, not known as calculus, right? So she started off with that quote, and then she said, I learned it at school, I learned it off by heart. Like I do, I learned it off by heart, right? Why did I know that off by heart? I've never used it. But when I left school at the age of 18, I think I cannot speak for everybody in this room. Do you know how to manage your mortgage? Do you know how to manage your finance on a car? Do you know what APR mean? Do you know what EPR mean? Do you know what your exchange rates are?
Aren't you taught compounded interest then?
Yeah, exactly. But how you don't get taught this stuff, right? But this is stuff that's really useful, and it's maths. So make sure everybody gets an A grade on that, because that's going to be really important in your life. That's me. I'll get back off my ranting voice. But I totally agree with what you said. I think it is a Western problem because we are focusing too much on short-term goals.
I don't think it's necessarily Western, like,
I think
country.
it's a Western problem. Looking at it, the whole thing, it's a Western, because it happens. So you just said yourself, you go from one company to the next, and the same thing happens all the time, right? As a contractor,
Not all of them,
but a lot of them, yeah. And I'm in the same boat. I go from one company to the next, and I see the same problem over and over again. So going back to what I said about Deming, Deming turned Toyota into a company that he helped turn Toyota into a company that delivered quality first. So by delivering quality first, they actually reduced costs, improved profit, and therefore, reduce costs, improve revenue, and therefore improve profit. Amazon's the same actually. Amazon have done the same sort of thing. They have not focused on dividends for shareholders. They focused on pumping their money back into quality. So everything they do is about quality.
On AWS or Amazon.com. I think this actually comes back to a very old analogy, which is the tortoise in the hare. We're obsessed with being hares, and we forget sometimes it's best to be a tortoise.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we just want fast.
I'm now trying to remember the thing about the tortoise and the bow and arrow. But, it's this great thing that you can fire the arrow after the tortoise, and the tortoise will never get hit.
Oh, that's Zeno's paradox.
Zeno's paradox. That's it.
You can't reach the other end of the room if every step you take is half the previous step.
Yeah.
So then there is an infinite number of steps, and it's an asymptote. You will never reach the other end of the room in finite time. But the thing is, you do.
Yes, because you don't actually do what the problem.
Well, there's also like the arrow is chasing the tortoise, and the arrow does whatever 10 meters per second or more. But in that time, the tortoise moves 1 centimeter. So in that 1 centimeter, the arrow takes whatever millisecond, and then the tortoise moves.
Who is it about the equation 1/2 plus 1/3 plus 1/4? No, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/16. If you keep on that,
transformation.
what's it called? Fourier, that's it, Fourier. If you add all that together, if you get that 1 to infinity, equal 1. So that's where you get the answer from. I think he proved that theoretically. That's how you get to 1. So Zeno's paradox was actually it's actually proved to be solvable through that Fourier's.
I tell you what, my maths stopped at O level.
No.
Itself.
Sometimes I read papers, and every now and again you get glimpses into some of this theory. It's like, that's good. Anyway, I'm glad you said Fourier. I couldn't agree more. That's good. So yeah, that was what I said earlier about how if you focus too much on business and not on security, you drift into failure.
But I think this incentives discussion is really interesting because that's what's on my mind really. It's like you asked, how could you go the next day and do that in your company? And I think I could, I'm in a position that I could just let's do this and we do it. But then it would be hard to justify that to the senior management that they're already prodding us around features, right? That's what you did. So how think my original question about like introducing it to the company also comes in a cultural level. Like, how do you justify the culture of doing seemingly random? I'm using this very wrongly, like random, but in the sense that
Deceptive, it's
you
perceived
can
as
test,
random, right?
yeah, perceivably random. Because for instance, what I had in mind was that last week, I don't know how many of you were aware, but CI, which is a CI thing, had a breach. Basically, all of the secrets got leaked, and we had a lot of secrets in them, right? That was Thursday. Thursday and Friday, basically the company was gone, like nobody could deploy anything, and we still lived the ripples of it. So I was thinking, if we had done the chaos engineering tests on the Circle CI, we could have prevented this, because it was really hard for us to change because we weren't prepared for it. But how could I have, before that happening, justify doing an experiment on something that it was perceived as something that it was okay, it worked fine for 3-4 years.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right, that kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
how do you bring that in a cultural level to a company?
I think, well, the way I've been talking to my clients about it is that you are going to fail, you are going to have a breach, it is going to happen, right?
It's not if, it's when.
It's not if, it's when, yeah, exactly. And what I was saying earlier as well, don't try and measure risk on each of the individual components. Don't be too reductionist in terms of what you're looking at. So don't say the risk of this is this and this. What is the plausibility of your company being hit by ransomware tomorrow? Right? What's the plausibility of that happening? You could argue it's very high. It's very plausible that it could happen. You take that to your senior leadership team and say, Joe, it's very plausible we can get a ransomware tomorrow because we don't have the right security in place. And using the word plausible because it gives more of an certainty about it rather than saying likely or possible. Plausible means it really is likely to happen. Again, what Alex just said, it's not if
It's not if, it's when. Always.
And so there's so many companies out there that turn a blind eye to security and got caught.
But did anyone who managed it lose their job? It comes back to a similar problem in finance, actually. You go back to finance, when the big crashes happened.
Oh yeah.
How many of the people who were making millions before the crash carried on making millions? And it's a false sense of marketing. But I think there is one way, actually, you can introduce this, which I have seen companies do, which is engineers articulate that as part of their development, we need to know about security. So the same as like you need to go to a conference about Rust, or you need to go and a whole bunch of engineers, the people management and the rest of it want to tick boxes to keep engineers happy. So one of the ways of keeping them happy is saying personal development. And then you go, well, we need to set up a security guild, have someone from each team, and we should try learning about these things. And part of that is to do exercises. Now what those exercises are is completely irrelevant. Like you could do chaos engineering, you could go and do something about how to go and introduce Metasploit and trying to do a whole bunch of other stuff. What it gives you is it gives you political momentum in the company to get people together and start thinking. And then the side effect of that activity is that actually people start to understand security. That's the big benefit. People's mindset changes about how they work code. And they start learning about risks. But that's not how it should be. But that's the only way I've seen it actually work. To kind of get the momentum for engineers and you really want to have somewhere in this company where we start to do security. I don't know, is that fair?
No, I think I've heard that before, and I think it's a valid point.
The other thing we're missing is if we were dealing with human life, which there is a financial number of. Okay, if you're a big company dealing with cars going into people, they have risks assessments based on how many millions you're going to lose. They have a whole industry of actuaries who are tied into risk management systems and people doing risk analysis. But we actually should start calling out and saying, well, where's our actuaries? I'm in a big company that's making 100 million a year. Why is an actuary sitting alongside the engineering team trying to work out what our big risks are and putting budgets into them?
Yeah, it's a good analogy actually.
The university
You wouldn't do insurance actually, but not necessarily, but in a context.
The university university at Kent have actually got they're quite involved in cyber insurance. They've written a lot of they've done a lot of research into cyber insurance. There's
Quite a
a
big actual course as well.
sorry.
They've got quite a big actual
Yeah.
course.
There's a speaker here at Codehop. Was it a KDM?
Which one?
So they were a cyber insurance company based in Kent. Can't remember their names. I think I might have been at KDM actually.
Okay.
Yeah, the talk was just about cyber insurance.
Oh no, we haven't.
But yeah, so I made the point of, cyber security is insurance against economic failure, basically.
Oh no, I know what you're talking about. Do you mean Dave Mears was talking about security
Two
in
women.
general?
Two women spoke together.
Sorry?
There were two women who talked together.
Two women? No, not two females speaking at the same time.
That's what.
Yeah.
That's what
a general thing, or just?
Yeah. We've had two women do separate parts, but not at the same time. Look at this. There aren't that many female programs
That
for
would have
a
been
start.
KDM. KDM, it's